Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. For those of you who haven't yet set up your audio, please do that now. Again, it's by going to Tools, then select Audio and Audio Setup. My name is Karin Shaw. I am part of the Office of Alumni Affairs, and I will be your moderator for the third session in our new lunchtime lecture series. We had a great turnout for our first two lectures and are thrilled so many of you are interested in reconnecting to discuss critical issues in public health. We very much want this to be a dialogue and look forward to your questions and comments after the lecture. The program we are using is called Illuminate Live. In the middle of the left-hand portion of your screen, you will see a text box where you can type questions. You can either type them as they occur to you during the lecture or wait until the question and answer part of the program. If you have a headset with a microphone, simply raise your hand by clicking the hand icon on the screen, and we will call on you to ask your question orally. You can also click the emoticons, the smiley face or confused face, to give us feedback during the lecture. Our lecturer today is Dr. Fred Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman is chair and professor in the Department of Health Services. His research focuses on economic influences on population health, with a particular focus on media use and child health. Dr. Zimmerman holds a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin. His research has caught the attention of the popular press, including NPR, the BBC, Good Morning America, The Today Show, The New York Times, and many other media outlets. Fred, we are thrilled to have you as our speaker. Without further ado, Fred Zimmerman.
Well, thank you, Karin, and thank you all for joining this conversation. The series here is called Continuing the Conversation, and we do want it to be a conversation, so feel free to, I don't think you can orally interrupt, but feel free to use the emoticons or to enter a question or a comment in the dialog box there. This talk is about the economics of obesity. I'm an economist, but as you'll see, I am more of an economist of population health than of health care. Many of you are familiar with this next series of slides. It begins in 1985. These are data from CDC, and it shows a geographic representation of obesity as it existed in 1985 from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And as you'll see, there are a few states in which the obesity rate is over 10%, and then several states in which it is less than 10%. We want to keep our eye now as we go through time on those states in which obesity exceeds 10% of the population. And as we march through the 80s, we see that there are more and more states in which obesity does exceed 10%. There are more and more blue states. Oh, now we've got some states where obesity actually exceeds 15% and is brushing up against 20%. As we move into and through the 90s, all states now have obesity rates of above 10%, and now some have, in the late 90s, have obesity that's over 20%. By 2000, just about half the states, oh no, now there are some that are actually over 25%. As we get into the 2000s, 25% of the population being obese is a lot. We've got fewer and fewer states that are only 15% obese by the time we get into the middle of this decade. Now we've got states that are over 30% obese. This is a real lot. Oops, went too far. So by 2009, as you can see, there's only one state that has obesity rates overall that are less than 20%. That's Colorado. And many states in which the obesity rate is over 30%. 30% for obesity is really quite high, and I'll talk about some of the consequences of obesity in a moment. But as you can see, this is very, very high rates of obesity throughout the country. Now, one of the points that I want to make with this series of slides, and actually I think I'm just going to do it all over again very rapidly so that you can see it more dramatically as we go through here. Obesity is just spreading. But the point here is really that it's affecting all states. So we can sometimes think of it as a geographical problem that particularly affects the southeastern states. But in fact, the increase in obesity affects all of the states, including California, which you'll see there has an obesity rate of 20 to 24%. And obesity, although we often think of it as a problem that affects the United States, we could do actually a similar progression of maps showing that obesity affects just about all countries around the world. This is a map of female obesity rates in 2008. The male obesity rates actually look fairly similar. And again, you see that the United States is relatively high on this scale, but not the highest. That honor goes to Saudi Arabia. The other states which are not as obese currently as the United States, the other countries that are not as obese currently as the United States are simply catching up more slowly, but the fear is and the expectation is that they will get there eventually. All right, so this is a serious public health issue. I think many of you are aware of this, but it doesn't hurt to get some facts out on the table. Obesity imposes costs of about $150 billion on the U.S. That's direct costs. Okay, so those are actual medical expenditures annually. That's a lot of money. And if we didn't have the obesity problem that we have, if you imagine that obesity rates were back where they were in the mid-'80s, we could probably save half or more of that amount of money. And if you imagine what we could do with, at a national level with $75 billion, we could do a fair amount. We could do a lot with whatever kind of health promotion you like, early childhood, any kind of health improvement could be done with this magnitude of money. So it's a very large financial problem. Obesity is also a major public health issue. It is the second largest cause of mortality after smoking in terms of behavioral risk factors. And I think perhaps most importantly, it has devastating effects on the quality of life. So we don't actually only care about obesity because of its costs. We don't only care about obesity because of its effect on mortality. We also are concerned about obesity because of the very deleterious effects that it does have on the quality of life of obese people. And that's a point to which I think it's worth returning. The question then arises as to what causes obesity, and this is really what I want to focus on. All right, now as an economist, one of the first places I look, of course, is to the economic literature about what causes obesity, and I found this graph in a paper. And what I think is interesting about this graph is that it shows what in economics is a downward sloping demand curve for BMI. BMI is the good here that is being modeled with a downward sloping demand. What that means is that if the price of this item goes down, more of it will be consumed. Now that makes a lot of sense if you're thinking about cars or vacations or any other type of good or service that you might want to consume. As the price goes down, people want more of them. But does it make sense for BMI? I'm not so sure. Economists will tell you that it does. That BMI, the body mass index, essentially obesity, is a good. But when we say that it's a good, what we mean is that, again, as the price goes down, people will want more of it. If they can afford more of it, they'll get more of it. But given that it has such terrible effects on quality of life, one wonders whether this is really an appropriate lens through which to look at the problem of obesity. Well, let's see empirically how this idea goes forward. So this is a graph here that shows over the course of several decades, in red, the mean BMI, the mean body mass index in the American population. This is data that I'm working on with a graduate student, Åsa Ljungvall, who is just finishing up a really lovely paper about trends in obesity. So these data are from her efforts. But what you can see here is that starting in about 1980, BMI, the average body mass index, starts to increase. Starting in 1990, it starts to increase even more dramatically. At the same time, in green, we have average food prices. This is the Food Consumer Price Index. And what you see there in real terms, that the price of food is falling during this period. So it is plausible to think that indeed, as prices fall, people are consuming more food, and that's making them more obese. Let's see what happens, though, when we add data from before 1980. So here it doesn't look so similar, because before 1980, in particular in 1970, there was a huge spike in the cost of food, and yet very little impact on obesity. So it doesn't seem to be the case that this huge increase in food prices led to any reduction in consumption of food. And from the early 70s through the 80s, the huge decline in prices didn't lead to a huge increase in obesity. So economists have formally explored this relationship using regression analysis, and a paper was published. And what was really interesting in this paper was that they found a link between food prices and obesity from 1980 to the present. They focused on 1980 because, as the cutoff point, because that was the time when obesity became a problem, and yet they didn't look at what happened at the relationship between prices and obesity before that time period. And I think you really have to do that. And incidentally, in that particular paper, they did not provide statistical significance of their estimates. So we don't, although they found a connection, we don't know whether that connection was significant or not. So I think that there's not a lot of plausibility, given this data, for the supposition that obesity is simply related to declining food prices. Another hypothesis is that obesity is caused by constraints. And here we have two graphs of the city of Chicago, two maps of the city of Chicago. On the left is a representation of what are called food deserts. The red ones are the census tracts in which it is far from any given household, on average, to the nearest grocer. The blue areas are those census tracts in which it's relatively close from any given residence to the nearest food grocer on average. And you can see the pattern there that in the northeast census tracts of Chicago, which are relatively prosperous, actually quite prosperous, they are pretty close to grocers, whereas in the much more impoverished south end of Chicago, those areas are much farther. So there's a pretty close mapping to socioeconomic status here. On the right, you can see that there's also a pretty close mapping to obesity. And what we see is that those areas that are far from food deserts also tend to be those areas that are most obese. And conversely, those areas that are near to grocery stores tend to be the least obese. But again, this is confounded by socioeconomic status, and so you really have to think about what would be the role of socioeconomic status. If constraints were really the issue, we would expect that, well, maybe budget constraints have to play some kind of a role. Constraints, it's not just about how far it is, but what kind of transportation you have. Do you have access to a car? Do you work somewhere else? Do you pass a grocery store on your way home from work? Do you have the time to go out and get groceries? These are all constraints that have to be part of the picture. And when you factor all those things in, you might think, well, really, it would be the poor that should be getting obese the fastest. It's not just about proximity to a grocery store geographically. That might be a part of it, but really it's about poverty. When we talk about constraints, we're talking about poverty in general, and people who are poor have multiple constraints. But here's a graph that shows what happens to BMI, the body mass index, broken down by income quartile. The red is the richest income quartile, and the gray is the poorest income quartile. And these are people of very different income levels at the bottom of the spectrum and the top of the spectrum. And what you see is that for any given year, indeed, there are differences in obesity. In any given year, the rich tend to be less obese than the poor. Their BMI is lower on average. But the trend in these lines is almost exactly the same. They're just about parallel. There are a few subtle differences, but the pattern is certainly very clear that obesity is a problem that is extending its reaches both to the rich as well as to the poor. So the extent to which obesity is really caused by constraints is not entirely clear. It may be that the disparities in obesity at any given time have to do with poverty and all the constraints that go with it. But it doesn't seem right to say that those poverty-related constraints are really causing the huge increase in obesity, which is happening throughout the country. Okay, so we started off with a bunch of maps that showed that obesity is pervasive and is becoming more pervasive throughout the country, in just about every state in the country. And now we have it broken down by income. And we can also break this down by the BMI distribution. And it turns out that people who are at the 15th percentile of BMI are also seeing their BMI increase over time during this period in much the same pattern that we see here. So obesity is something that is a pervasive social phenomenon. It is not just limited to one ethnic group. It's not limited to one socioeconomic group. It's not limited to one geographical area. It's not limited to one gender. It is truly pervasive. So when we look at a phenomenon that is as pervasive as the increase in obesity is, we really have to be thinking about some social force that affects all of us more or less equally. We have to, in other words, get beyond preferences, incentives, and constraints. So I'm working with a multi-level socioeconomic theory of health behavior. We start at the biochemical level, trying to understand what motivates people to make the decisions that they make. We then model the individual level so that we actually look at the decisions people do make and some of the incentives that they're facing, some of the constraints that they're facing. But we don't only look at those incentives and constraints. We also look at where the decisions arise from at a physiological level and what influences those decisions from a social structural level. What are some of the social factors that might influence individual decisions that are made around obesity? One of the tools that economists often use is called rational choice. Not only economists use this framework for understanding individual decisions, but economists notoriously do. Rational choice idea is that people weigh the pros and cons. They do so rationally, and then they make the decision that's going to be in their best interest. The rational choice paradigm has really come under scientific attack recently. It turns out that it's actually quite weak. Behavioral economics, as well as psychology and marketing, have shown that preferences don't exist in any meaningful sense. So when people are weighing two options and they decide to do what is in their best interest, that's the rational choice paradigm. The idea of what's in their best interest actually isn't as well defined as we might think it is. We can manipulate what people think is in their best interests. We can change what people's preferences are. I'll show you a specific example in a minute. But preferences are not stable, they're not exogenous, and they're not consistent. At the same time, neuroscience has shown that decisions aren't rational. So even if people did have stable preferences, people aren't actually able to weigh the pros and cons in as rational a way as we might think. Of course, we all think we're rational, and each and every one of you listening is perfectly rational. Don't have any fear on that concern. But in fact, what these experiments in this brain science have shown is that people are actually not highly deliberative with most of their decision making. They are, in fact, highly emotional, and sometimes their decisions arise out of unconscious factors. So there's a lot that goes into individual decisions that is not strictly relevant. Let me pause for a question here. A question on diagram, biochemical, individual, and social. Is the reason why the oblongs? No, that's because I'm not. In answer to Reggie's question, is there a reason why the oblongs in the diagram differ in size? Yes, because I'm not that good at PowerPoint. That's the only reason. But thank you for the question. This is a very interesting experiment from Dan Ariely, and I do recommend his book. It's a popular book. Of course, it's based on a lot of articles. He wrote a popular book called Predictably Irrational, which is a very good read, very fun read, and I highly recommend it. I don't remember if this example was in his book or if it was in one of his papers. I took this graph from the academic paper, but what he did was he read his students' poetry, and then he divided them into two groups. And one group he said, "How much would you pay to listen to more of my poetry? I'm going to be giving a reading tonight, and you know, if you're willing to pay a little bit of money, you can come and listen to the reading." The other group, he said, "How much would you have to be paid to listen to more of my reading tonight? I'm giving a reading, but I don't want to be there alone, so I'm willing to pay some people to show up. How much would you have to be paid?" And people gave their answers to one or the other question. Now remember, the groups were randomized. And this little graph here shows how much they either wanted to be paid or were willing to be to accept payment, depending on how long the poetry reading was going to be. And what you can see here is that if it was 6 minutes long, the people who were asked, "How much would you pay to listen to more of my poetry?" said, "Oh, I'd pay about $3. The people who were asked, how much would you have to be paid to listen to my poetry? They said about $5. They would have to be paid about $5. And what's so interesting here is that poetry is not defined as a good or a bad thing. It's that he was able to manipulate whether people were willing to pay for something and they thought of it as a good, or whether they had to be paid to endure it and they thought of it as a bad. And there are many experiments that are similar to this experiment, and all of them show that, in fact, people's preferences are really not as strong or as firm as we might believe. I'm going to pause again and answer a question to Sherry, who asks about references. There is a paper. Much of this talk is based on a paper which I will be happy to make available. I don't know whether there's a capacity to put it on the internet or not, but I can certainly do my part and share that with everyone. Okay, the emerging science in this area shows that this is really how people make decisions. This diagram is a little bit complicated. I'll walk through it. There are biochemical networks of associations in the brain that are simply patterns that are reinforced as we think about things, as we make decisions, as we have experiences. And these patterns form networks of associations. Now, they can be associations of, for example, touching something hot and feeling a sensation of pain. And then you begin to associate touching a hot thing with a feeling of pain, and that becomes generalized. And so that when you see something, in your brain, this association of heat with pain is activated, and you know not to touch it. You don't think through rationally the pros and cons of grabbing a red hot poker iron. Your brain has these associations, so it knows. And these lead to habits of mind. And an example of a habit of mind for the purposes of obesity research is the idea that a snack could be a candy bar. So for example, we could ask a bunch of school kids, what's an example of a snack? Some might say apple, some might say carrots, some might say a Snickers bar. And so there are differences when you think about what is a snack in terms of what comes to mind. Marketers call this salience, for example, or fluency. And we could measure fluency in any of a variety of ways. It is possible to get an objective measure of fluency at the individual level and also at the population level. So you take any particular habit of mind, for example, the idea that a snack would be a candy bar, and we can actually measure that objectively. Those habits of mind then lead to decisions and actions. So the fluency of this habit of mind that a snack is a candy bar leads to people tending to purchase and consume candy bars as snacks. There's also a feedback mechanism here, because the more people choose to eat candy bars as a snack, it reinforces the idea that a candy bar is a snack. And conversely, if people eat raisins or carrots or something as their snack, then that reinforces that idea and tends to decrease or depress the fluency of the idea that a snack would be a candy bar. This is one example of a habit of mind. Other examples include values, beliefs, internalized social norms, internalized constraints, rules of thumb, heuristics, and cognitive frames. Let me just take one small example from my research of a different kind of a habit of mind. I've done a lot of work on the effects of media and television in particular on child development. And part of that work has been interventional, getting parents to have their young children watch less TV, and particularly less commercial TV. And one of the comments that we sometimes get from parents is, yes, but you can't raise kids without TV. Or specifically, how do you make dinner without having the kid watch TV? How am I supposed to take a shower without TV? These are all examples of internalized constraints. They're not real constraints. People have been able to raise children without TV for many generations. The human race has survived without TV for several millennia. But they are internalized constraints. People perceive them as constraints because they've become habits of mind. Because they've gotten in the habit of only showering when their kid is watching TV. They can't imagine any other possibility. Habits of mind have a long history in economics. If you know anything about Thorstein Veblen, he's one of the early institutional economists who wrote back in the turn of the 20th century. Very well known, most well known for having coined the phrase conspicuous consumption, but he was actually a very profound economist. And he was one of the earliest people within the tradition of economics to develop this notion of habits of mind as an underpinning of individual decisions. Although it does have a longer genealogy as well in the instinct habit psychology of, that had existed before even Veblen's time. Habits of mind exist at the individual level, but they exhibit population variation. Now that's significant because we can measure them. They have an effect at the individual level, but we can also measure them and observe their effect at the population level. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Habits of mind are passed down through the generations. The importance of habits of mind is really that they help us to make good decisions with minimal cognitive effort. And that's why they're passed down through the generations. So, for example, you may learn from experience not to touch a hot stove, or your parents might actually intervene and help to create this habit of mind that you shouldn't touch a hot stove. So there is an element here that gets passed down through the generations. That's quite important. Habits of mind can evolve over time. This little diagram here, the animation doesn't quite work. But what it shows here is that there's a distribution of habits of mind. Again, since we can quantify them, we can create a histogram at the population level. And what happens is that certain habits of mind are subject to disciplinary pressure, or selective pressure, if you will. Usually those are the habits of mind that are at that are sort of outliers, that are at the ends of the distribution. So for example, if you asked a bunch of kids in a class to give 10 ideas of a snack, and there was some kid in the class who said carrots and raisins and apples and peanuts, and got through the whole list of 10 and never listed any candy bar, any sweet. Other kids in the class might make fun of him. What? I can't believe you didn't say Snickers, and what about M&Ms? And that would be an example of selective pressure. So this kid didn't have that equation of snack with candy as part of his habit of mind, but the other kids in the class would be exerting a selective pressure on his own habits of mind. Another way in which selective pressure can happen is if somebody, let's say, eats a candy bar and they find that they really like that as a snack. That gives direct personal pleasure. So that would also exert selective pressure because then they're likely to remember that as part of their habits of mind. Now, so personal experience can exert selective pressure on either end of the distribution, but the vested interests of others can also exert selective pressure, and that's where we'll go next. There are several different types of discipline that exert selective pressure on the evolution of habits of mind. The first is repetition. For example, advertising would be a good example of that. There is social sanction, like the kids making fun of this kid who didn't list any snacks. And there is also prices. Prices are an example of if you walk into the store, you're used to buying your candy bar for $1, and you walk into the store and it's suddenly $2, you're going to feel a twinge of pain. And that will exert selective pressure as well. Okay, other kinds of discipline are rewards, like payments or social status. And then education, not meaning formal education necessarily, but just other people reinforcing these habits of mind. Now this is the key take-home point from this presentation. If you remember nothing else, I would like you to remember this, that power is the capacity to exert selective pressure on habits of mind at relatively small cost to oneself. So think here specifically of advertising and other kinds of marketing. That people who are able to advertise, it doesn't cost them that much, and they are exerting selective pressure on the habits of mind that we all share. So vested interests use power to influence the evolution of habits of mind, but structuring institutions, such as rules and laws, structure the way in which power may be used. In other words, a structuring institution would be like, for example, can you advertise sugary beverages in a school? Yes or no? And if you can, then that gives more power to the people who are trying to influence habits of mind around whether to drink sugary beverage with lunch or not. Okay, so this is just a diagram of the overall multi-level theory of health behavior. It basically says that there is a social level of habits of mind, and there is an individual level, and there's sort of a feedback here. It's some technical slide. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. So this is the multi-level theory of health behavior in a nutshell. Individual decision-making arises from habits of mind. That's distinct from the rational choice framework. The distribution of habits of mind evolves under selective pressure. And finally, structuring institutions such as laws, rules, norms, structure how power can be exerted on the evolution of habits of mind. Now let's go to marketing. In marketing, this is one of the main ways in which habits of mind around food and diet have been influenced. The marketing mix has 4 elements: product, price, place, and promotion. When people talk about advertising, they sometimes think about when people talk about marketing, they sometimes think only of advertising or even only of television advertising. Those are in the promotion category, but they're not even all of the promotion category, and they're certainly not all of the marketing mix. Since the 1980s, what has really changed is that technological and regulatory changes have enhanced the power of marketing in each of these elements of the marketing mix. Okay. There's been tremendous advance in food science. Product innovation has exploded from about 6,000 new products a year in 1985 to 16,000 new products every year in 1995. It's fallen off a little bit since then, but it's still going at a very good clip. In 1976, the typical supermarket stocked 8,000 products. Now it stocks 40,000 products. Now, what's important about that is that you can now buy just about any kind of potato chip you want. If you want to imagine yourself taking a vacation in Hawaii, you can either go to Hawaii or you can buy Maui potato chips. If you want to think of yourself as a cowboy, you can get the Mesquite barbecue potato chips. You have lots and lots of options now that didn't used to exist. So marketing has become aspirational. As much as just about selling the product itself. You're not just buying a potato chip, you're buying a whole identity. And that gives a lot more power to marketers. So this product innovation has vastly improved the ability of marketers to change our habits of mind by tying into our emotions, our aspirational emotions. Price is another element in the marketing mix, and although I sort of poo-pooed the idea of price at the beginning, I want to be clear that price can be used in different ways. So when the price of a product goes down, one way is to just lower the price for everybody. That's sort of the rational choice argument. I don't think that's really how price works. I think what happens is they increase the portion size. And this graph is sort of from a famous experiment in which the experimenter gave moviegoers either a small box or a large box of popcorn. And the people who got the large box ate 34% more popcorn. And it was stale. So when marketers see declining prices, one of their responses is to increase the portion size or to create value meals. And by doing this, it's not so much that the consumer necessarily pays less. The consumer might pay the same amount but get more. And what happens then is that the consumer eats more. And that works for the marketers. It doesn't work so well for the consumers who are becoming obese. Place is another element in the marketing mix. And the picture on the right is from a school. I think we all know by now that there are not just vending machines, but even fast food restaurants, chain restaurants that have set up in schools. But an important but subtle change is the vast increase in the number of places where you can buy food. By food here, I mean, candy and stuff like that. I don't mean groceries. You can now buy candy in just about any hardware store, just about any sporting goods store, just about any auto parts store. And that's really what's changed. And numerically, there's been a 70% increase in the per capita food outlets that are non-grocery stores. And so that's been a huge change. When you see candy all the time in front of you, that is another thing that reinforces this habit of mind that candy is a snack, because you're always seeing it. And finally, we get to promotion. This is what people usually think of when they think of marketing, but I want to talk about promotion as distinct from advertising. So these are some non-traditional kinds of advertising. Of course, there's the internet we all know about. That's not even on here. But the product placement essentially started from zero in the 1970s. And then in 1982, E.T. was shown in a movie picking up Reese's Pieces. And the lore is that the sales of Reese's Pieces increased 60% after that film. And that really launched the product placement industry. And now product placement is everywhere. It's a $4 billion industry. We have it's on American Idol. It's everywhere. Another subtle form of promotion is corporate sponsorship. That existed back in the 70s, but in 1980 it was about a $300 million industry. It's $7 billion today. Corporate sponsorship is absolutely everywhere. Now that $7 billion isn't all food, but a lot of it is food, beverages, alcohol companies, and so forth, fast food restaurants. And then finally, in-school advertising has just mushroomed dramatically since the 80s, from essentially non-existent to being very prominent in many schools now. Okay, so just to review, these are some of the examples of increased marketing power: product, price, place, and promotion. The economics of obesity. The traditional story is that marginal changes in incentives, which would be the declining food price over time, has led to increased food consumption. I think that's a very minor part of the story. I don't think food prices are directly, at least, not a big reason why we have this obesity problem. The other argument that you sometimes hear is that it's the time cost of food preparation that's gone way down. There are other reasons why I think that's not a plausible explanation. I think that really it's the power of marketers that's driving obesity. It's the huge increase in marketing. The power and the scope of marketing is really what's leading people to eat more, again, across the country, geographically, socioeconomic status, and even across the distribution of BMI. Even thin people are getting fatter. So again, this just shows kind of in a nutshell what's going on. There have been changes in marketing power, and through the effects of selective pressure on habits of mind, there have been changes in habits of mind and changes in food choices, which lead to pervasive obesity. I want to give just one concrete example very quickly, which is the value meal. And in the 70s, it would have been unusual. Certainly in the 50s and 60s, it would have been almost unheard of for people to drink a Coke routinely with lunch. This is something that was much more seen as a special treat. It was not something that would have been routine. and something that would have been kind of frowned upon, particularly for children. So maybe, going out for to a sort of classic 50s diner, you might get a Coke then, but that was a rare event and something that it just wasn't seen as routine. You certainly wouldn't have a Coke with a meal at home. In the 70s and increasingly in the 80s, that began to change, particularly with value meals, because a meal went from being, a meat and 2 veggies to burger, fries, and a Coke. And it's the Coke there that really has pushed us over the top in terms of calories. So again, I want to reinforce this take-home point, which is that power is the capacity to exert selective pressure on habits of mind at relatively small cost to oneself. People make decisions out of their habits of mind, and when we allow certain forces in society to have this kind of power, then decisions will be made which are not necessarily in our best interest. That's the end. So now I will take your questions, and let's see here. I think I'll turn off my mic and let Karin.
Well, thank you, Fred. We have about 20 minutes left for questions. And if you're wearing a headset with a microphone, you can raise your hand by clicking the hand icon under the participant box. If you don't have a mic, simply type your question in the text box. I guess we have a question here. Fred, you might just want to read the question as they come up and then answer them.
Okay, Reggie has a question. Among the 4 marketing strategies, product, price, place, and promotion, which is most likely to influence habits of mind? Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it has been the subject of some quantitative research. But what that research seems to be leading toward is that, in fact, all of these strategies go together. Promotion is the one, again, the part of the marketing mix that people think about most readily. But if you think about it, it's very difficult to disentangle these things. So, for example, all of the different varieties of potato chips, and potato chips is just one category, but this occurs across all different food groups. But if you come out with a Mesquite brand barbecued potato chip, that's great. You put it on the supermarket shelf, and you're going to sell some of it because people are going to look at that and they're going to say, hey, that could be interesting. But if you also promote it, then you can promote the aspirational qualities of it. You can make it, you can make it seem like, hey, this is an exciting part of being a cowboy, or this is an exotic flavor, and all the rest of it. So you create the aspirational aspect of that product through the promotion. But the promotion only works if you have the product. But the product sells best if you also have promotion. And then, of course, you add in the place, and again, the place is so important. You see you see an ad for a product, and that's promotion. But if you see the product itself, that's also promotion. So putting a product everywhere is part of promotion. And that, by the way, is what many chain stores do. For example, Starbucks. It's the cluster retail strategy. That Starbucks opens so many outlets in part because a Starbucks store, that's an example of place, right? Having a Starbucks everywhere, but it's also an example of promotion. So I guess to answer your question, Reggie, more succinctly, these strategies are not really distinct. They all go together and they work best together. Okay, Ben asks, what type of policies are being considered to limit the influence of for-profit marketing? Overall, very little. And I think that the area in which there is some room in a policy debate is around children, and in particular schools. So California, both California and Los Angeles roughly simultaneously did pass a ban on sugared beverages in school, and noticed that at about the same time there was a reduction in obesity among school children. Now, so then some statistical effort was put into did the policy change cause the reduction in obesity, and that's a bit unclear still, but it does seem like it's promising. So I think that's probably where the best opportunity is to intervene is with children and protecting children. Let's see here. I don't. Some would argue that obesity. Let's see here. Some would argue that obesity is particularly high in lower-income neighborhoods because of limited access to healthy foods. How much do local, state, federal policies impact access to healthy foods? Do you have any propositions for change via policy? Yeah. One of the interesting aspects about the obesity epidemic, which I didn't share in this particular talk, is that fruit and vegetable consumption is not what it should be. And that's kind of usually what people are talking about when they talk about healthy foods per se. But on the other hand, fruit and vegetable consumption is actually increasing. So at the same time that we see obesity just skyrocketing, we also do see some modest and inadequate, but nevertheless somewhat meaningful increases in fruit and vegetable consumption. So I do think it's very important to understand that obesity is not the converse of a healthy diet. Obesity is, essentially eating too much of everything. And that's particularly easy to do with sugared beverages and with snack foods. And if you look at the increase in calories broken down by eating episode, it's almost all in sugared beverages and snack foods, and almost none of it is in meal times. And that also should tell us that really what we're concerned about, when we're concerned about obesity, really what we're concerned about is excess calories and not sort of a healthy diet more broadly. But, of course, it's also true that we do want to promote healthy diets for other reasons. And, of course, we would like people to eat more fruits and vegetables. And, yes, I do think that there are lots of things that local, state, and federal policies could do. And some of them that they already are doing. For example, to encourage the expansion of farmers markets, make farmers markets more accessible, make it so that food stamps can be accepted at farmers markets. These are all things that are underway. Of course, there are always nutritional education programs. Those are very helpful. And then all the way up to federal policy. I'm not one of the people who believes that subsidies, food or agricultural subsidies are causing obesity. I don't believe that's true. But I do believe that they are one element that is leading to a very poor quality diet. And I think that the agricultural subsidies ought to be addressed for that reason. Let's see, Andrew, how much of the increase in consumption over the last 2 decades would you gather is a result of marketing? Well, of course, it's very difficult to estimate that quantitatively because what we have is it's a social change that affects all of us equally. And, well, it doesn't affect all of us equally, but it is something that all of us are exposed to. And because all of us are exposed to it, we can't use our usual traditional statistical methods to disentangle the incremental effect, let's say, of marketing as opposed to other things. That simply won't work when we have a social phenomenon like this. So it is difficult to say, but I do think that what I will say is that the increase in the power and scope of marketing is the single most persuasive causal argument for the increase in consumption. I don't see any other persuasive causal mechanism at play here. Again, I don't see the general decline in food prices by itself. It's just not a plausible explanation. Other people have argued about the changing American work environment. I think by itself that's not a very plausible explanation, in large part because those changes started at the beginning of the 20th century and have been very smooth since then. So I don't know, Andrew, what percent it is, but I do think it's the most plausible explanation that we have right now. Okay, San Francisco, Eric. San Francisco recently proposed legislation that would have disallowed toys in children's fast food. unless they met a certain nutritional standard. SS Mayer, Gavin Newsom, I guess, vetoed the measure. But do you think this? Yes, I think that approach would have a lot of impact. Because of course, when you put a toy in with a fast food meal, what you're trying to do is to create an affinity. And that's a pleasant affinity, and that reinforces this habit of mind of eating fast food for lunch, or for dinner, or for breakfast. And so that people don't sit around and decide, weigh the pros and cons, like where would be the best place for me to eat lunch today? They have their habits. We all have our habits. For children, those habits are reinforced very strongly when they get a toy. And I think that it's really quite unethical for food sellers to engage in that kind of manipulation of children's emotions. And by the way, the American Psychological Association has come out with a similar statement. They have structured around advertising. They've said it's unethical to advertise to children because it manipulates them in ways that they're not well defended against. But again, I really think that including a toy there is another form of marketing that's just as effective as traditional advertising. So yes, I think that would be a very good approach, and I think it would have considerable impact. Let's see here. Okay, Sherry, how can incentives be aligned for both business and public health? Oh, well, that's a very big question, and I have thought about that some. I think that the hard part is going to be identifying ways in which food manufacturers can make a profit on foods that are healthy. If you think about, the growth in the population in the United States is relatively slow. Excuse me. And so if you want to be in an industry that's growing more than the population rate is, then you have to increase consumption. And that's been the model. You have to increase consumption, or you have to increase value added. And through new food products, food manufacturers have attempted to do both. And in fact, I have another graph somewhere that shows that the biggest increase in consumption has occurred in those areas of food which are the most highly processed. Excuse me. Corn and potatoes and things like that. The lowest increase in consumption has been in those products that are not highly processed, such as eggs. So the question then is, how can we encourage food manufacturers to start making food that's going to be tasty, but not consumed overly much? And I think that there is a real conflict there between the business side of it and the public health side. And sometimes I think we just have to say to certain industries, as we said to the tobacco industry, or the asbestos industry, that the interests of public health really ought to trump those of a particular industry. The problem is that the food marketing industry is so huge that we're up against a very challenging constituency. But I think that we've been up against challenging constituencies before. I'm sure we will again. So I think that if we in public health can be very clear about what the consequences are and what the causes are of the problem that we're facing, that is something that's going to give us a lot of political leverage. Let's see, do you think the marketing of certain body types in the popular media similarly influence body image, or is that defeated when thin people promote unhealthy foods? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what that means. Is that defeated? But I do know that there is a central paradox that's been identified in the media research, which is that people are encouraged to be very thin, or people are encouraged to consume a diet that's going to make them heavy, and then they're encouraged to feel bad when they actually get heavy. So it's a double whammy from the media, and it's also true. There's been some interesting research that people who are most self-conscious about their size are the ones who are most subjected most vulnerable to the effects of food marketing on what they eat. So there have been some interesting experiments exposing people to commercials and then seeing the effects of those commercials on what they eat. And some of the people who are most susceptible to those effects are women who are on a diet. And that is very interesting research. Okay, what are some successful strategies made on the part of community organizations to help curb the obesity trend? Well, again, there was the ban on sugar beverages advertising in LA schools, so that was certainly a success. But I think that the successes are limited, and one of the reasons I think that's the case is that there's a lot of confusion over obesity. I think that I haven't talked much about physical activity. Physical activity is certainly part of the solution. It's part of the problem. Physical inactivity is part of the problem. Physical activity is part of the solution. But it's only one part, and it's probably not even the biggest part. I think that the general consensus is that it's the increase in calorie intake that has led to most, not all, but most of the increase in obesity. Now, Tony Yancey is doing some really interesting work on, and others, on the interconnections between physical activity and diet. But I think that part of the problem is that there has been confusion here that that people make their own decisions, that it's up to personal responsibility, and people should be more disciplined about what they eat, and all of that. The research is really pretty clear that it's not just about personal responsibility, that it's relatively easy to manipulate what people eat in experimental settings. We also know from the marketing research that marketing really works in terms of what people buy. So there's considerable evidence that it's not a personal decision. But the continued rhetoric that it is a personal decision makes it very difficult to engage in public health. But I think that's what our goal is, and that's what our unique perspective as people in public health can be. We understand that there are social forces. We understand that that public health is not simply the aggregation of individual health. That public health means something more about that a healthy community is not just a collection of healthy individuals. That's what we in public health can bring to the table, and I think that the first step in that is to recognize what the true social forces are that are acting on the obesity epidemic. Okay, then Ben asked, are there examples of societies internationally that have been limited in their exposure to increasing levels of marketing? Are they getting bigger too? That's a really good question, and I've been asked that before, and I don't know the answer to that. I haven't done any formal research on that. I do know that obesity is increasing in many parts of the world, but I also know that marketing is increasing in many parts of the world. And again, you can have relatively small bore prohibitions on advertising, but that's not going to stop the huge juggernaut of marketing writ large. So if you, for example, there have been bans on ads in children's TV, and sure, that's great. I think that's an excellent start, but that's not going to solve or overcome all of the other kinds of marketing that are going on. So I do think we need a much, much bigger approach. So that's the answer to that, and I do think obesity is going to be a global phenomenon.
Well, it sure is frightening to hear about the development in the realm of obesity, and I think the questions show well that it's concerning all of us. But we are out of time for more questions. Thanks to you, Fred, and to all of you for participating. We will not have a webinar in December because of holidays. So please join us January 19th when we will continue the conversation with Dr. Dick Jackson. Dr. Jackson argues that in the face of staggering environmental challenges, we must build smarter and more livable communities to restore and protect our health. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you back in January.